certain history of caste, which is a history of oppression, but it also means becoming Dalit in the sense of the viewpoint of positive crystallization, of a positive, what we also call movement. A movement of people coming together in new forms of political possibility, political transformation. Now, this minoritarian, extremely powerful current of thinking that has gone on, it seems to me is now confronting a challenge of thinking about something to do with how to look at those great structures, like state, like religion, like law. These, of course, state and law and religion are also very closely linked to each other, and that is the point. How to look at them not for their classical values, not for their mastery and sovereignties, but for their inherent logic of exceptionality. This seems to me the third moment which confronts us today. Now, that is the reason, one of the reasons, I think, that we are now talking about religion, for instance, in the language of return, that there's a return to religion. There's a return to thinking about religion, but it's not only about religion. I think there is a tremendous preoccupation with the state, with law, in the way that there was no such preoccupation in the 80s with some of the great European thinkers and with some of the great historical thinkers of our society. So I've always, and this is just a footnote, and I know Prasanta doesn't like footnotes, so I'll keep it short. Giorgio Agamben, the very influential Italian thinker, he had come to India and we had heard him and we had spoken to him. And he has said many a time, and he said it in India, that Michel Foucault, who died unexpectedly at a young age, did not work on law. He did not sufficiently discuss law. And as you know, Agamben discussed a lot of law in relation to theological law, secular law, constitutional law, and so on and so forth. But it seems to me Agamben is wrong. Let me say it. He's wrong. Because there is a reason why Foucault didn't work on law. He was not interested in law as a discourse in the same way that he was not interested in religion as a discourse. He did not think religion or law as sufficiently clarified or politically or analytically interesting thresholds of carrying out a research or an analytic intervention, which someone like Agamben today is compelled to undertake. So for those reasons, I think Agamben is, he's of course to great effect appropriating Foucault, and no problems with that. But in terms of his thesis on Foucault, Agamben is wrong. That Foucault, even if Foucault had lived for many years, he would not have treated of those things unless the times compared him to. That is quite possible. That the very shape of history would change to compel someone like Foucault to look at law as an independent autonomous threshold of analysis, which in his own times, which is in the 70s and 80s, he is not impelled or compelled to do. Now, in that sense, I think Foucault and such people are still working, and subaltern historians who are very clearly and wonderfully inspired by Foucault in our context are not looking at law as a separate domain. I do not think, despite appearances, that the subaltern historians take religion as such as their object. I think what they do take is the becoming other, which religion helps to in a sense, produce a certain platform for or passage for. In itself, religion as a major object is not the subaltern historian's interest at all, it seems to me, despite appearances and despite the accusation that is made against that. Now, in contrast to that, in the present times, I think we are interested in law, like Agamben and others, religion and the state, not again for their classical values. I do not think it's a question of return to religion, or return to law, or return to the state. At least the ones who are performing wonderful critical work. I think these are sites, or these are objects in which the classical demystification simply exposed it for its structuredness, for its contingency, for its abstract systematic nature. What it did not do was to show that even within these great structures there was a logic which was inconsistent. There was something which was happening there which in a sense was trying to produce a certain kind of command structure. So for instance, in theology today, we see that the people who are looking at theology, like Agamben for instance and others, who are looking at theology, are saying that and Derrida, Jacques Derrida in Europe started that, what we're seeing in theology is something which is the limit of theology. So what theology is really wanting to do is to produce a command or a law for the world where it is not meant to, because very well we know very well that theology is a study of God, of religion, of divinity. It should not have anything to do with the secular domain, and that is the classical secular credo that God in his domain and the world in its own. But that is clearly not true in practice. And what is not true in practice today is also becoming an investigation for logical and methodological thinking. That there is something about theology which is not purely theological. So theology is an open structure to what is not theological. Similarly, what we speak of when we speak of the old Marxism of, let's say, historical materialism in here, I also would like to mention Jairas Banerjee's very interesting essay on historical materialism in this book. We see that in historical materialism, in Marxism, which are either taken as an act of faith, which is the same thing as science, as Marxist science on the one hand, or rejected fully, in total, because it was an emblem of a certain kind of dogma, a dogmatic, closed, narrow-minded thinking, and so on and so forth, which also led to actual political oppression, political domination. So that kind of thinking today is being re-examined. And of course, Jairas didn't write it recently, but this is a good essay to take a cue from, where you see a notion coming out in Jairas' writing, which is something which is very discredited in Marx, which is the notion of Asiatic mode of production, the Asiatic way of looking at production. So when you read Marx, you see that everything that apparently does not follow or fall into the great schema of historical materialism, moving from slave modes to feudal to capitalism and so on to the future communist society, is in a sense clubbed together in all kinds of non-European examples are taken and called Asiatic, because there's a form of extraction there which does not quite fit into the organic energy of historical materialism. Now this is the usual way of looking at Asiatic mode of production, and we know that it also becomes a kind of a sign or a symptom of an essential error or flaw or even corruption in Marxism, such that the entire structure falls by the test of its thinking about colonialism and other than Europe. So the problem of the other, the minor, again comes back. This minoritarian critique comes back. But today what we find is, and Jairas uses a very interesting term, that it is possible to look at this entire question of the Asiatic mode of production, not merely to reject it. Of course it has to be rejected in terms of its literal, propositional, the way it comes to us, it has to be rejected. But what it can still serve is what he calls a logic of configuration. He doesn't use the word exceptionality, he uses the word configuration. So he says that all the exceptions, that is, you can take China, you can take India, and you can take several other examples, South Africa, each of these exceptions to the Europe thesis can be put into a configuration. And in a sense, capitalism, the thesis on capitalism has to be a thesis on configuration rather than a thesis on the dualist option of a major European idea of capitalism and a minor outside capitalism spatial or colonial, post-colonial imagination. And I think that's an admirable thesis, because configuration produces what he calls a concrete understanding of capitalism rather than the abstractions that we too easily swear by or reject in something like Marxism. And I think that's a very interesting notion, but what it still does not sufficiently address, and that is the point which I want to bring out very minimally today, is that while configuration does explain a whole movement of heterogeneous capitalism globally over a very long period of time. And Asiatic mode of production is something like what could be called a cipher for that. It's not a concept, it's like a cipher. For everything that we do not understand about European mainstream abstract capitalist, historical materialist theory of capitalism, where even fundamental individualist notions of free labor have to be partially rejected, which is absolutely fantastic as an analysis, Jerris's analysis. Nevertheless, what he does not take on board or deal with is the question that what it does to European capitalism or historical materialism itself. Because, after all, even at a minimal level of abstraction, something like capitalism, if it makes any sense, it makes sense as a system. It is not a matter of only policy, of national policies, or government, or governmentality. It is a question of a system minimally. And if it is a question of a system, then it must have a certain kind of generic universality. And if the generic universality itself can be shown to be inconsistent in its very definition, then I'm saying something radical is happening. Where you see that Marxism is not simply an absolute theory of revolution against an absolute social diagnosis of the ills of capitalism or capitalism itself. Marxism is an inconsistent response to an inconsistent world. So capitalism is something which is world-dominating, global, but at the same time its logic is fundamentally erroneous. Does not mean that it's an absurd or a completely irrational system. No. What it means is capitalism is able to manage something which is Asiatic, which it does not understand, within its own movement. So something which it does not understand actually moves into its logic. That is its inconsistency. So if concepts mean, science means something which you understand, here is a case of a concept without understanding. So capitalism has a concept called Asiatic through Marx. And yet, it is not a concept which leads to understanding. But it leads to a real symptomatology. It leads to a real movement of capitalism itself. In that sense, capitalism is a reality, and its knowledge has to be consistent. It must have a blind spot, because the system has a blind spot. And that logic of exceptionality is today coming out in religion, in law, in the state, in the understanding of the state. So for instance, the question of emergency powers of the state. I mean, we always know that from the emperors to even democratic, in democratic politics, that there are exceptional powers that the state has. Constitution gives itself those exceptional powers. And yet common sense tells us that there must be some kind of fundamental change between empire, imperial systems, and democratic people's popular sovereignty. There must be. And yet, we live our daily lives all the time inconsistently, moving between the normal democratic law and the exceptional emergency measure. And we do it, we adapt to it. Yeah, it's a question of adaptation. But it never occurs to us, more or less, because if it occurred to us, we'd die or be paralyzed with shock, that something which belongs essentially to an imperial mode of thinking belongs as much essentially to democracies. Even if democracies in every other respect are indeed very different from imperial systems, and indeed for a greater good, for tremendous freedom. In India, we know how much movement we enjoy as free people. No one can doubt that, and yet, for certain peoples in certain places who I don't have to name, we all know, and anyone can be in that position, the state is as much imperial as the imperial state. So it is not accidental. The point is, this thinking today is coming out, that this belongs to the thinking of the modern democratic state. Which is not to say that democracy is false, which is to say democracy is inconsistent. In the same way that God is inconsistent, or theology is inconsistent, in the same way that law is inconsistent. And you can take the example of science. The great meta-knowledge of all knowledges is science. And science is supposed to be in that sense, science is the same as the culmination of the encyclopedia into its final form. And mathematics is the Galileo said the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. So in that sense, nature as science looks at it would be the absolute picture of rationality, transparency. No exceptions, no logical exception here. And yet, with the studies that have happened today between history of science and humanities and several other such paralogical studies, let me call it that, what we find is even in the Galilean revolution, the great revolution in the 17th century, what we find is a moment in Galileo where he saw something he did not understand, which is when he turned the telescope up to the sky, to the moon, he saw spots there. Now, the point is, Galileo started off on what he did not understand. What the Ptolemaic, the Greek astronomy did not help him understand. Because the system which was Ptolemaic, which is an absolute system, is absolutely self-consistent. If you agree with the position of the planets and the planets, then the system makes sense. But Galileo saw something which did not make sense. And historians today tell us, and there is much to be learned from such studies, that this not making sense is the first and the real revolutionary moment. It is not the other sense, which is the new scientific sense that we glorify, including the greatest praise, people who praise scientific revolution on is the Indian right, the Hindu right. I mean, why else would you want the aeroplane to be there, aeronautics to be there 5,000 years back? Because you are praising science. You are a great fan of modern science. That's a simple explanation. No, the point is, and so you see in the greatness, the consistency, the absolute rationality of modern science. So that's I would think the Hindu right is the most rationalist force today. But this rationalism does not take into account the fact that the moment of the scientific revolution is a moment of the spot, the blind spot, the exception, something which the system doesn't understand. And the only system you have is the existing encyclopedia, the discourses of knowledge. And at that moment, Galileo is born, and Galilean mathematics is born. Galilean mathematics, or any mathematics for that matter, in its real radical sense, is not the inscription of some